There are proper ways to show diversity, and forcing stories that don't exactly tell real queer perspectives aren't always, the best and most effective way of creating a more tolerant world.
I completely agree. Welcome to Visions in Focus, the premier podcast that talks to the up-and-coming queer artists of tomorrow. I'm here joined with Elizabeth Griesser and Sean Guzmán. Hi, thank you so much for joining me.
Hello. So excited to be a part of this.
So, just kind of getting to know you guys. What was the first piece of queer media that truly moved you or made you feel seen?
Sean, you want to take this first one?
Okay, yeah, I'll go first. My piece of media is gonna have to be Barry Jenkins's Moonlight. I first watched it when I was 15 years old, so that's like 2020. It was a moment for me, kind of helped me come to terms with my own queer identity, but also kind of taught me the power of filmmaking in general. Yeah, it was just like a transcendent emotional experience for me.
I love that. I love that. Elizabeth?
I have a similar one, but I also have another one that maybe is not so transcendent. But my first one is a cliche, but Portrait of a Lady on Fire. It was such a beautiful film. And not only did it explore queerness in a very unique way, it just explored love in a very unique way. And I really appreciated how the director was able to capture these two women in a very complex and interesting setting and time. Yeah, it's just everything is beautiful about it. And for my other media that I think was eye-opening was The L Word. And while it may not be always the best show to reference, what made it special for me was just how normalized queer women were. And I'd never seen a context like that before. So in that sense, it was pretty empowering.
That's amazing. Kind of just jumping off of that, do you think that queer media in the past, media that you grew up with, was it necessarily more coded, or do you think that it was very like literal? Like, how do you view the filmmaking and like media process of creation in relation to like the past? Do you think that it was more impactful than what we're seeing today?
I wouldn't say more impactful, but it has always been there. I think definitely, early cinema or queerness in cinema was extremely coded. And I've done a couple of essays about this. And I think one of the best examples is All About Eve. That is a very queer film, but it's not a queer film. So, there were lots of queer people working on cinema and creating what we now know as cinema. And they were putting their own touches on their projects, creating the culture that we now know. But of course, all of the federal restraints and everything prevented people from publicly recognizing it as queer media. It just was media with a little undertone queerness that you can never fully put your finger on. Now that is not the case. Well, hopefully it will continue to not be the case. We'll see how politics change in the coming years. But, right now you are allowed to have queer characters. So it is less coded, but not always for the better, I'd say. I think this can be a bigger conversation later, but diversity can be used. And I think certain corporations have used it not always for the betterment of the minority communities.
I mean, let's have that conversation now. Like, how would you describe the current state of queer media?
Threatened is one word I would use to describe it. There are a lot of good queer films out there, good queer TV shows. And that's because we are able, in the past couple of years, we've been able to uplift queer artists who have been able to tell their own stories and tell their own perspectives. But there are still been trends of diversity. And, the bigger corporations have used that to draw in different audiences. But I don't, there are proper ways to show diversity, and forcing stories that don't exactly tell real queer perspectives aren't always, the best and most effective way of creating a more tolerant world.
I completely agree. And I see that as well. I think that kind of the thought that's always in my mind is, are queer stories still being made for queer people?
Yeah.
Sean, like, I don't know how you feel about this, but like, do you think that mainstream companies have become more accustomed to making like a digestible piece of media while still like wanting to check off the requirements for mainstream audiences? Do you think they're just trying to make it more digestible?
I think it's an interesting conversation because I don't know if it's necessarily necessarily more digestible as opposed to something that is provocative enough to a specific type of audience. A film I'm thinking about while we're having this conversation is like Emerald Fennell's Saltburn, where you kind of have queerness used as a metaphor for obsession, or I don't want to say intense desire because that's something more than desire. And that's like not something that's atypical, but it's almost in that film, I feel like reimagined and painted in a light that is a depiction that is seemingly more positive than it actually is. I think it appeals to a consumer base that maybe is not entirely well versed in the historical oppression of queer voices through like these harmful stereotypes. And so it's able to like appeal to people in a different way, in a way that I think could produce harmful rhetoric. But at the same time, you also have like innovative filmmaking that is really working to push the boundary. But I do think when it comes to like what is being pushed at the mainstream, I would say I feel like it's queer cinema that is not necessarily like digestible in the sense that queerness is not multifaceted, but it's still not like all encompassing. It's something that we're missing right now is kind of enough queer subjectivity. I don't think there are enough films that kind of discuss queerness from the lens of a queer person's interiority, which is kind of scary. And I hope we can get to a place of that.
I completely agree with that. I mean, you both have worked on such extensive projects that evaluate so many different levels of the human identity, and you both do it like so flawlessly. So I was just kind of curious, how has your work now, how do you kind of see that building up to kind of what you want to work towards in the future in terms of representing these stories and also showing your own identity in what you create?
Yeah, well, I'm working on a couple of projects that, are more exploring my sexuality. And I am trying to be very practical about it because I do want to go, not against the grain, but what has been pushed out so much. Sean and I have actually had the conversation about Saltburn before. We recently saw a film that was very similar to Saltburn and just, had the same narratives. And even the other film that we saw at the festival that we attended was about sexuality in a way, but it was used as a shock factor. And I think that has kind of been the pushing narrative that sexuality is some sort of shock factor. So I think for me, I am trying to explore more complex internal struggles about queerness. One thing that I'm exploring right now is a type of rom-com. The other story that I'm doing is like a psychological thriller. Very different genres, but both kind of have, like what Sean was saying, some interiority, because that is very much missing from the stories that I would like to be seeing. And yeah, just always questioning, what do I want to see? What am I missing in my representation? And how can I explore that side of me while still being inclusive, but not pushing a shocking or generalizing narrative onto a community?
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I think I would say, I don't know, I feel like a lot of current film landscape has been entrenched in like a digital culture where kind of it becomes homogenized because it's just like what everybody's talking about online. And I think for that reason, we have seen a kind of rise in independent cinema across like the landscape in general, with like more people being interested in it. You see mainstream kind of trying to appeal to that like consumer desire now. So like Elizabeth said, I think it's a great thing in general.
You mentioned what people want more of. What do you think more people want more of? Like looking into the future, what's missing from queer media right now? And like, what do you want to see more of in the future?
I'm trying to see some intersectionality. That's what I'm trying to see. I think there's a lot of more queer narratives being told. I would love to see some queer narratives of color. I would like to see those narratives specifically get more of a spotlight. I think there's some great stories out there that just aren't elevated enough. And I think we see that even when it comes to like media about marginalized people in general. I think a great example and like point of inspiration for me and my work now moving forward definitely is Ramel Ross's Nickel Boys. I mean, like such a great film that hones in on subjectivity in such a unique way, really overlooked at award season despite getting its few nominations. But I think it's definitely a step in the right direction that it was getting that attention despite its extremely limited release. So it kind of makes me hopeful for that realm of cinema in the future.
Yeah. I definitely agree. Intersectionality. And kind of with that, I think people want genre hybrids. And I think that they're rejecting typical narratives, typical genres. People don't really want to see a cut and dry action movie anymore, even though people still really want action. That's like, I'm pretty sure that's the top requested film by the public, but it's not drawing in audiences even though it's requested. So what does that mean? I think that means that people want to see new takes. And I think for queer media would be Bodies, 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 just the horror comedy, being in, having that sense of intersectionality. Like, maybe not the best film in the world, but a really enjoyable film that I think speaks to an audience. So hybriding and pushing everything on top of each other, experimenting. I think that's what the public is seeking.
I completely agree. The first one that comes to my mind is like Bottoms, like the
Yeah.
mix of like the action slash comedy slash like high school
Hmm.
drama. Like I completely understand and agree that like that's kind of like what audience are wanting. Like they want to see not just one type of movie anymore. They want to see so much and they want to see like themselves represented in that as well. So it's time for our segment, Rapid Fire Reels. I am just gonna ask a quick grouping of questions. First up, underrated queer film that everyone should watch.
The way he looks.
I'm sticking with Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. That
Okay,
movie made me
okay.
laugh.
What is like a dream collaboration that you have with a queer director, queer filmmaker, queer just artist in general?
Oh, Sir Ian McKellen, but in a queer role,
I'll
because he has
say
not had enough of those.
I'll say I'm Justice Smith.
Mm.
Okay. Your most favorite queer character of all time, who is it?
Well, any like Rachel Sennett character. Yeah, just her actually as a character.
I forget his name, but Joseph Gordon-Levitt in Mysterious Skin. I just want to hug him.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay. Last one, a queer trope that you're absolutely just sick of.
The obsession trope.
Same. Fuck Emerald Fennel. Sorry.
Sorry, let's get it out of here, please.
Well, let's end with one last final, just overarching question. Looking into the future, how are you personally navigating the balance between your identity and storytelling and what's next for you in that?
I feel like just like not holding back, continuing to try to imbue everything I do with a sense of humanity and taking in diverse perspectives. I think something that's really important that is often overlooked is the conversations about who is behind the camera. And I think even in kind of our independent world, it's so easy to look around a set and see a lot of people who look exactly the same, which is unfortunate. But in the fast-paced nature of wanting to make something great and quickly and just calling on people, automatically you risk creating a film that is inherently biased with not recognizing who is behind the camera and the story that's being told in front of the camera.
Definitely. Very much agree. I think for me, I'm always pulled to philosophical, a little mythological stories. And, that is always an interesting thing to kind of reimagine, the stories that we know into queer perspectives. But I've been enjoying doing that in my writing lately. I think as a director, I do want to explore more physical sexuality. I'm really good friends with an intimacy coordinator, and the conversations that we have are just so fascinating to me, and how physical sexuality is something that has been so overlooked and taken for granted in Hollywood, and how I think, being an independent filmmaker, that's like a scary thing to do. But I do kind of want to take on that challenge and set an example to myself and to others that people can show physical intimacy respectfully, and just reimagining that concept.
That's amazing. Well, Sean, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining me. This was so fun getting to just pick your brains about a topic that you both know so much about. And this has been Visions in Focus.